In 1985, Mayor Gerald Whitmore and his 11-year-old daughter Nina vanished after a quiet morning visit to the local church. No signs of struggle, no goodbye, just 2 empty seats at Sunday supper. For 8 years, Rosefield lived with unanswered questions. Then, during a routine church renovation, work broke through the floor and unearthed a secret that explained everything. What really happened beneath St. Mary's would haunt the town forever. The morning of June 14, 1985, began like any other in the small evergreen town of Rosefield, Oregon. Nestled between dense fir trees and winding rural roads, Rosefield woke slowly, bathed in the cool hush of Pacific mist and the hue of early summer. Dew still clung to mailboxes and porch rails as Mayor Gerald Whitmore stepped out onto his front porch, tugging at the sleeve of his linen jacket. He glanced over his shoulder at the front door, which soon creaked open to reveal his daughter, Nina, clutching a half-eaten apple and her canvas sketchbook. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, adjusting his collar. Nina nodded, her copper ponytail bouncing with each step. She was 11 and precocious, with a fascination for drawing insects and an aversion to church hymns. But today was different. Today, Gerald had promised her a special peek at the renovation project, the old bell tower of St. Mary's Church, a relic from 1882, long deemed unsafe, but now finally being restored. As they drove through town in Gerald's navy new Chrysler, 5th Avenue, shopkeepers waved, and early joggers offered nods of recognition. Gerald was popular here, not just as a mayor, but as a father, a neighbor, a man who attended every town tax sale and high school play. It was that sense of community trust that made what came next all the more devastating. Gerald turned onto Miller's Pass, the winding road that connected downtown Rosefield with the outskirts where St. Mary's stood, half obscured by creeping ivy and overgrown shrubbery. "We'll check the scaffolding, maybe climb to the 2nd level," he told Nina. "But you stay close, all right?" Nina gave a mock salute and resumed sketching something on her lap. A crow, maybe? Or one of the tower's gargoyle carvings. It was the last confirmed sighting of them both. By 10:00 a.m., when the church staff arrived to resume work, there was no sign of the mayor or his daughter. The foreman, puzzled, thought Gerald had perhaps changed plans and gone to check supplies at the lumber mill. But by noon, when no one had heard from him, the calls began. At first, no one panicked. Gerald was reliable, but he also liked it on Saturdays, sometimes taking Nina to his late wife's favorite hiking spot near Pine Hollow. Still, when the sun began to dip and no one had heard from him, when calls to his house, his secretary, and even Nina's school friends yielded nothing, a different kind of silence fell over Rosefield. At 5:37 p.m., Deputy Clara Ricks found Gerald's car off the side of Red Rock Trail, 5 miles northwest of town. It wasn't parked, it was abandoned. The doors were unlocked, the driver's seat pushed slightly back, as though someone taller had driven it. The keys were still in the ignition. Nina's sketchbook lay on the passenger seat, open to a half-finished drawing of the bell tower, shaded meticulously in charcoal. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no signs of struggle. Sheriff Tom Baird was called in, a veteran with 2 decades in the Oregon State Police. He scanned the scene with a sense of unease he hadn't felt since the unsolved disappearance of a hiker 3 years prior. "It's like they vanished mid-thought," he muttered, inspecting the untouched contents of the trunk. That night, volunteers from all over town gathered at the station. Flashlights, CB radios, and old search maps were laid out. Even local teenagers joined, combing through Pine Hollow, the surrounding ravines, and along the Rosefield River. No scent trails were found by the search dogs, no discarded belongings, nothing. By the 3rd day, the FBI was alerted, not because of a confirmed crime, but because a mayor and his child don't just disappear in rural Oregon without raising alarms beyond county lines. Speculation spread like wildfire. Was it political? Gerald had recently blocked a controversial land rezoning. Was it personal? A townsperson reported seeing a brown sedan idling outside Gerald's home late the night before. But leads led nowhere. The car was never identified. Rumors clashed and collapsed on each other, some claiming he staged his own disappearance, others believed in darker intentions from someone close. Then came the letters. 1 week after their disappearance, an envelope arrived at the town hall, addressed in shaky, blocky handwriting. Inside was a note. They shouldn't have opened what was meant to stay closed. Now they're part of it forever. It was unsigned, no fingerprints, no traceable ink or paper source. Sheriff Baird ordered a sweep of all church blueprints, tunnel rumors, and even the graveyard records, but nothing stood out until an old groundskeeper mentioned something strange. Back in the '60s, a sealed crawl space had been bricked up under the sanctuary floor due to structural weakness. No one had opened it in decades. Still, without concrete evidence, the case stalled. Nina's mother had died of lymphoma when the girl was 7, leaving Gerald a single father. His devotion to Nina was well known, and the suggestion he'd harm her or flee with her was met with disdain by those who knew him. Yet 8 days after the disappearance, with no progress, the narrative shifted. Officials began to whisper of mental stress and private burdens. The town held a vigil on the 2-week mark. Candles lined the church steps. A photograph of Gerald and Nina smiling in the summer sun by the 4th of July fair rested on a wooden easel. People waited and waited. But June 14th became July. July turned to fall, and slowly, like fog retreating into the woods, the memory of what happened began to fade, though not for everyone. By the 7th day, the stillness that hung over Rosefield had transformed into a tangible unrest. Gerald and Nina had been missing for a full week, and with no trace beyond an abandoned car and a half-sketched drawing, the town began to unravel at the edges. In the town square, yellow ribbons tied around lampposts fluttered in the breeze like half-hearted prayers. Every conversation in Rosefield, from barbershops to diners, began and ended with their name. The townsfolk, usually mild and neighborly, now shifted between suspicion and sorrow, looking over shoulders and out windows, hoping for a sign that never came. Sheriff Baird, under growing pressure from both the county and the community, authorized the largest coordinated search in Rosefield's history. Nearly 80 volunteers gathered at the town hall parking lot early that Sunday morning. They were divided into groups, armed with radios, laminated maps, and supply packs donated by the local market. Firefighters, Boy Scouts, school teachers, even the mayor of a neighboring township came to help. Helicopters were dispatched from Eugene to sweep the perimeter of the forested ridgelines, while search dogs were brought in from Portland, specially trained to pick up long cold scents. They combed through brush and ravines, ducked under fallen trees, and scoured the banks of Pinebrook Creek. It was there, at approximately 2:46 p.m., that volunteer searcher Dale Evans spotted something lodged between 2 river rocks. He pulled it free, a single white sneaker with a pink logo, soaked and muddied, but unmistakably Child's Park. He pulled it in, and by dusk the area surrounding Pinebrook was sealed off. Back at the sheriff's office, Clara Ricks laid the shoe on brown paper under a heat lamp. It was a youth size 5, the same Nina had been seen wearing in a photograph taken the weekend before her disappearance. No blood, no laces. It wasn't conclusive proof of foul play, but it sent a fresh wave of dread through the department. As the news spread, the atmosphere in Rosefield shifted again. Hope, which had been clinging to the edges of disbelief, gave way to something darker. Candlelight vigils became thinner, school hallways quieted. Kids who once biked to each other's houses now waited for rides at the curb, their parents hovering nervously in parked cars. Even Sunday services at St. Mary's saw a sharp drop in attendance. The tower renovation halted, the scaffolding left to rust in silence. Then came the whispers. It started innocently enough. Murmurs in line at the grocery store, theories swapped between sips of coffee at the diner. Someone claimed to have overheard Gerald arguing on the phone about missing funds days before he vanished. Another swore Gerald had been acting off, pacing in the church nave after hours, muttering under his breath. At first, Sheriff Baird dismissed these as stress-fueled nonsense, but the more he heard, the more a question began to worm its way into his mind. What if this wasn't abduction? What if it was escape? The town's newspaper, the Rosefield Record, added fuel to the fire when, under the byline of Editor-in-Chief Mason Kemp, they published an editorial titled "The Vanishing Mayor, Victim or Flight Risk." It referenced a $200,000 0-cent discrepancy in the restoration budget filed with the town council a month before the disappearance. Although no formal charges had ever been made, the suggestion was planted. Had Gerald embezzled funds and fled with his daughter before the truth surfaced? The editorial drew both ire and intrigue. Some rallied in defense of Gerald, citing his years of service and spotless record. Others, particularly those who had always harbored quiet resentment toward his growing influence in council decisions, leaned into the theory. Even local radio hosts began taking anonymous calls, claims of seeing Gerald in Washington, or a man with a girl matching Nina's description at a rest stop near Mount Shasta. None of these tips held weight, and yet each one chipped away at the narrative that something terrible had happened to them. What troubled Sheriff Baird most was how quickly the town seemed ready to believe that Gerald, widowed, devoted, deeply tied to the community, could simply disappear without a word. It made him wonder, did they know something he didn't, or was grief simply taking strange forms? Things took another turn when a former city treasurer, Lorraine Kessler, came forward quietly one evening. Sitting across from Clara Ricks in the dim back room of the station, Lorraine confessed that months earlier she had noticed unusual withdrawals from the town's historical preservation fund, amounts rounded to even numbers, always withdrawn just before a weekend, always signed off by Gerald. She never questioned it then, for everyone did, but in light of the editorial, the pattern unsettled her. Clara took the report seriously and logged it for follow-up. When she presented it to Baird, he was reluctant, but agreed. Something was off. If Gerald was indeed misappropriating funds, it didn't necessarily explain his disappearance, nor Nina's, but it introduced a new possibility that someone else had discovered it before the sheriff did. And maybe, just maybe, Gerald had been silenced not because he was guilty, but because he wasn't willing to stay silent about someone else's crime. Back in town, the speculation intensified. Gerald's home was broken into twice in the span of a week, not looted, but searched, as if whoever entered had been looking for something. Files, bank records, a diary. No fingerprints were recovered, no suspects identified. Nina's school locker was pried open during the night, though nothing appeared stolen. Someone was still digging. Someone wasn't finished. A full month passed, then two. Pinebrook Creek dried to a trickle under the August sun, and the muddy footprint of a child remained near the spot where the shoe had been found, preserved under caution tape and sparse hope. Clara visited the site often, haunted by what she couldn't explain. At the record office, Mason Kemp received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside were 3 Polaroids, one of St. Mary's Tower under construction, one of Gerald shaking hands with a man no one recognized, and a blurry close-up of what looked like building plans circled in red ink. There was no note. Mason lacked the photos in his desk and said nothing, and still the bells of St. Mary's had not rung since June. The scaffolding stood skeletal, empty, and the shadow of Gerald Whitmore stretched long across Rosefield, father, mayor, fugitive, or victim, no one could decide. Not yet, not while the truth remained buried, not while one child's shoe lay alone beside a creek bed no one dared to approach after sunset. 9 months after Mayor Gerald Whitmore and his daughter Nina vanished without trace, the official tone of the investigation began to change, not with a revelation, but with a growing fatigue that blanketed the entire process. The evidence remained stagnant: 1 abandoned car, 1 wet sneaker, and 100 conflicting whispers. Sheriff Baird, once resolute, now spoke in disclaimers. The community, once mobilized by urgency, grew numb from repetition. Flyers faded under rain. Candlelight vigils stopped, and behind closed doors at the sheriff's department, the once open case slowly receded into bureaucratic shadow. The language in the final report was cautious but conclusive. No indication of struggle, no evidence of objection. Circumstantial signs may support the possibility of voluntary departure. It was not what anyone wanted to hear, but it was the only option left without hard proof. The word runaway was not used directly, but it hung in the margins of every summary. As Rosefield struggled to digest the weight of unresolved grief, attention began to shift from mourning Gerald to replacing him. The town's charter dictated that, in the prolonged absence of a sitting mayor, the council had the authority to appoint a successor by special vote. On a gray March afternoon, with very little fanfare, Wallace Dean was sworn in as acting mayor. He had been serving as the council's finance chair for the past 6 years, known for his reserved manner and fondness for process over personality. Where Gerald had been charismatic and hands-on, Wallace was technical, distant. The council justified the decision publicly as a matter of continuity. "We cannot run on emotion alone," Councilwoman Trudy Myers had said, her voice barely hiding irritation during the brief press conference. "We owe the town functionality." But behind the scenes, Wallace wasted no time exercising his new authority. Within his first 10 days in office, he issued a moratorium on all expenditures related to the St. Mary's renovation project. The scaffolding around the church, already weather-worn and creaking from neglect, was ordered dismantled. Contractors were released, equipment returned. In his official memo, Wallace cited budgetary redirection and structural integrity reevaluation. But no one missed the underlying implication that whatever had happened in or around the church, he wanted it buried with the renovation itself. This decision was met with confusion and quiet resistance. Father Milton, the priest at St. Mary's, voiced concern at a town hall meeting, stating that the original cracks in the tower's upper frame still posed a hazard, especially during Oregon's stormy seasons. His words were noted, then ignored. Even Clara Ricks raised questions internally, reminding the sheriff that Gerald had shown particular interest in the church's substructure before he vanished. But Baird, weighed down by his own doubts and the pressure to move on, did not reopen the discussion. Wallace's rise to power came with little celebration. He avoided interviews, rarely made public appearances, and when he did, he spoke only in exacting, neutral phrases. Some found this refreshing after months of emotional turmoil. Others found it unsettling, as though something human had quietly exited city leadership. Still, Wallace had his supporters, those who appreciated efficiency over sentiment. Business owners who had grown impatient with the stalled construction, taxpayers wary of funding fruitless investigations. Wallace, they said, was practical. He made hard calls. But under that cold practicality, questions simmered. No one could quite remember Wallace speaking at Gerald's memorial vigil, nor could anyone recall him visiting the Search Command Center during the early months. While others grieved, he had remained silent, watching. Then came the audits. Under Wallace's direction, the town initiated a review of all civic projects funded in the prior 2 fiscal years, citing a need for financial transparency following public speculation. On paper, it was sound governance. In practice, it functioned like controlled erosion. Records were moved, archived, redacted. Names once discussed in open council meetings were no longer mentioned. The restoration budget, the same one Mason Kemp had highlighted months earlier, was quietly folded into a larger infrastructure fund, one with looser tracking requirements. Lorraine Kessler, the former city treasurer who had previously spoken to Clara, was quietly replaced at her own request, though she never appeared to give a farewell or statement. When Claire tried to contact her weeks later for follow-up, Lorraine's phone was disconnected. Her house had a for sale sign. The listing agent claimed she'd moved to be closer to family in Boise, but no forwarding address was provided. Sheriff Baird, meanwhile, began to detach. His once daily reviews of the Whitmore file became weekly glances. Calls to the FBI liaison went unanswered or ignored. Claire noticed he started arriving later to the station, sometimes looking like he hadn't slept. When she asked if something was bothering him, he only said, "Some things are too quiet for too long." Still, no new evidence surfaced. No new witness stepped forward. As spring turned into summer, Rosefield adapted. The town calendar resumed its seasonal rhythm, the Founders' Day parade, the community fair, high school graduations. Gerald's face was still on the missing posters near the town bulletin board, but fewer people looked up at them. Nina's schoolbooks were quietly returned to the district office, never collected. St. Mary's, stripped of its scaffolding, now stood unchanged since 1984. The weeds grew taller along its foundation. The wooden front doors remained locked most days, except for Sunday morning service. The bell tower, once intended for full restoration, now remained off-limit entirely. No one climbed its creaking interior stairs. No one asked why the last renovation blueprint had Gerald's signature next to a circled section beneath the sanctuary. Wallace Dean began holding private meetings on city development, citing security reasons. Minutes from these sessions were brief and vague. Mentions of structural reassessment and historical concerns replaced detailed engineering reports. Clara requested access to some of the older construction records, citing continuity for the new patrol team. Her request was denied on the grounds of Around this time, a young maintenance worker named Bryce Holloway, who'd recently joined the town's civil services unit, reported hearing something strange while inspecting the church basement after a rainstorm. An echo behind the back wall, like air trapped where it shouldn't be. He mentioned it casually to his supervisor, who told him to leave it alone. The next week, Bryce was reassigned to waterworks. He never brought it up again. Still, on her own time, Clara drove past the church more often. She would stop on the edge of the gravel lot and just sit, engine idling, staring at the stone facade, and wondering what had been silenced when the town turned the page too early. Wallace's car was sometimes there, parked behind the rectory where no one could see it from the street. On one night, Clara swore she saw a light flicker behind the uppermost tower window, just once, like the brief reflection of a candle. But when she returned the next morning to ask Father Milton about it, he simply blinked and said, "No one has keys to that level anymore." And so the tower stood, quiet, its renovations undone, its secrets sealed. At least, for now. The first time Luis Contreras heard Gerald Whitmore's name again was during a radio segment while he was driving down from Salem to Rosefield for a brief contract job. The broadcast mentioned the 9th month mark since the mayor's disappearances, a clip filled with hollow phrases about community perseverance and unanswered questions. Luis turned the volume down and tightened his grip on the wheel. For him, Gerald's name didn't echo with mystery or media fascination. It carried a weight Luis had been trying to forget for nearly a decade. Back in 1985, Luis was a young carpenter, just 26, working for Penrose Construction, the firm contracted to handle the initial stabilization phase of St. Mary's Bell Tower renovation. It was his first big project outside of Portland, and like most ambitious tradesmen, he took the assignment seriously. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded according to schedule, shoring up rotted beams, reinforcing floor joists, replacing warp boards near the nave. But on June 12, 2 days before the mayor vanished, Gerald had called Luis aside for a special request. They met inside St. Mary's during late evening hours when most of the crew had gone home. Gerald, still in his town hall attire, walked him through the sanctuary with precise, almost anxious steps. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to interrupt. "There's something under this floor I need checked," quietly. Luis had frowned, glancing down at the aged wood beneath their feet. The area behind the pulpit wasn't part of the official blueprint, nor was it listed on any of the work orders. "You mean foundation issues?" he asked. Gerald shook his head. "Just a suspicion, a hollow spot, something that doesn't belong." Later, Louisa would recall the mayor's tone, firm but nervous, not like a man looking for rot or mildew, but like something following a trail no one else knew existed. At Gerald's insistence, Luis returned after dark with basic tools, no heavy equipment, just a pry bar, a headlamp, and gloves. The sanctuary was cold and unusually silent. Father Milton had locked up hours earlier, unaware of the arrangement. Under the weak yellow glow of a single-floor lamp, Luis worked in the area Gerald had marked with chalk, a narrow rectangle at the back of the stage platform. As he pried up the first row of old planks, he noticed how dry the subfloor was. Too dry, like it hadn't seen fresh air in decades. He tapped it lightly and heard the unmistakable echo of hollow brick beneath. After pulling back 4 floorboards, Louise uncovered a patch of dusty masonry that was visibly inconsistent with the rest of the church's foundation. Most of the building rested on thick basalt and river rock, but this patch was different, lighter in color, crumbly, like something hurriedly mortared together. Curious, he brushed off the dust and gently struck it with his camp bar. The sound that followed made him pause. It wasn't the thud of solid earth, but a dull reverberation, as though there were empty space beneath. He kept going. After another 30 minutes, he had chipped away a small opening, revealing not dirt or stone, but a dark void. A pocket of air no more than 2 feet deep, enclosed in all directions. He lowered a flashlight into it and glimpsed the corner of something. Wood or fabric? He leaned in closer, adjusting the angle of the beam. Then Gerald reappeared. He must have been waiting outside, because the church door didn't creak until Luis was already elbow-deep in debris. "Stop," Gerald said quickly, his voice cutting through the silence. Luis turned, startled. "It's hollow under here," he said. "There's something—" "I know," Gerald interrupted. His eyes darted toward the open floor and then back at Luis. Put the boards back. Seal it. Don't mention this to anyone." Luis stared at him, confused. "But if this is a structural flaw, it needs to be reported. This could affect—" "I'll take care of it. Please, just seal it up," Gerald insisted, now stepping forward and grabbing Luis's shoulder. There was desperation in his eyes, not fear of physical danger, but fear of discovery. Gerald looked like a man protecting something more than a building. Reluctantly, Luis followed orders. He reassembled the planks and re-nailed them, covering the hollow cavity with the same boards he had just removed. Gerald didn't explain further. He thanked him, paid him $150, 0 cents in cash from his own wallet, and told him not to return the next day, said the project would be paused for inspection. 2 days later, Gerald disappeared. Luis kept silent for years. He convinced himself the cavity was some archaic crawl space or misplaced cellar feature, maybe forgotten when the church expanded in the 1940s. And if the mayor had some reason to keep it quiet, well, maybe it was political, maybe personal. Luis moved on, left Rosefield 6 months later, and didn't return until 1993 for a short gig replacing window frames at the courthouse. That's when he saw Wallace Dean on the steps of the municipal building, shaking hands with state representatives, proudly unveiling the new civic budget plan. Luis recognized the man instantly. Dean had visited the church once during the early renovation weeks, back in '85, to observe progress. He'd asked questions then, ones that Luis now remembered sounded oddly specific. Had they accessed under the sanctuary yet? Were there old blueprints? Any digging? Luis hadn't thought twice about it before. Now the pieces didn't sit right. Haunted by what he knew, or thought he knew, Luis paid a visit to the sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone who handled the Whitmore case. Sheriff Baird wasn't available, so Clara Ricks sat down with him in interview room 2. Luis hesitated at first, unsure whether dredging up old memories was wise. But eventually he relayed everything: the late-night excavation, Gerald's strange urgency, the hollow brick chamber. Clara listened intently, not interrupting once, only scribbling notes. When Luis finished, she closed her notebook, leaned back, and asked a single question. "Do you think what you found could hide a body?" The question chilled Luis. "I didn't think that then," he said, "but now, I don't know." Clara didn't dismiss him. She thanked him, promised to log the information, and said she'd cross-referendation it with the original renovation orders. But as Luis left the station, he glanced across the street toward St. Mary's. The bell tower was still, silent as ever. The place looked unchanged, as though frozen in the same breathless moment he'd last walked through it. And in that moment something new unsettled him. Not just the memory of what was buried, but the question of why Gerald had known it was there before anyone else. Because whatever had been hidden beneath the sanctuary floor, whatever Gerald had stumbled onto, hadn't just been forgotten. It had been intentionally sealed, and someone besides him knew about it. Someone who, even now, might still be watching. In the spring of 1993, after almost a decade of dormancy, St. Mary's Church was finally approved for its long-damned interior restoration. A new mayor, freshly elected and eager to distance himself from Wallace Dean's cold legacy, greenlit the church repair project that had once been Gerald Whitmore's passion. Local contractors were hired, blueprints dusted off, and plywood walkways were laid out across the uneven sanctuary floor to prepare for structural work. Though time had worn the stone walls, the core of the church remained firm, except, it turned out, for the very heart of the sanctuary. On April 18th, 2 workers, Kyle Drennan and Marcus Flynn, were assigned to remove the aging floorboards behind the pulpit. The oak was warped and brittle, having absorbed decades of rain through a neglected leak in the tower. With crowbars and drills, they pried up each section, stacking planks neatly along the side aisle. Beneath the floorboards, they expected to find simple support beams and crawlspace voids. Nothing complicated. But within minutes, Kyle tapped a patch beneath the central platform and frowned. The hollow, dry sound they anticipated never came. Instead, his boot struck a dull, dense thud like striking stone. Happened on the way in. Beneath the wooden planks lay a solid slab of poured concrete, at least 5 inches thick, smooth but crude, with an uneven gray hue that clearly didn't match the older foundation walls nearby. Kyle ran his gloved hand across the surface and looked up at Marcus. "This doesn't belong," he said, and Marcus nodded slowly. They checked the renovation schematics twice, Old blueprints, yellowed with age, still stamped with Gerald Whitmore's signature from 1984. There was no mention of concrete in that section, only wood and subbeams. No permits, no changes filed. Marcus radioed the site foreman, who contacted the project manager. Within the hour, the sanctuary was taped off, and a small group of supervisors and local engineers gathered to examine the find. The church's architect consultant, Jane Ellison, examined the patch with growing concern. "This isn't part of any retrofitting we've ever seen," she said, "and if it was structural, it would have been noted. Someone poured this intentionally." With the area secured, demolition gear was brought in. Over the next 2 days, workers began breaking up the concrete in sections. Chunks were carefully removed and bagged, each revealing more of the strange slab. By the third afternoon, Marcus's jackhammer hit a pocket, an airspace concealed just beneath the concrete. He paused, sweat glistening on his forehead, and called for everyone to step back. As dust settled, a square cavity was revealed, roughly 6 feet by 4, not deep enough to be a cellar, not wide enough to be a proper room. It was more like a crypt or a hiding place. The opening emitted a sharp, dry smell like old linen sealed for too long. When Marcus lowered a flashlight into the void, the beam caught on fabric, muted colors, layers crumpled in a heap. At first they thought it was insulation or discumpled in a heap, but then Jane leaned in and caught sight of something unmistakable. A human hand. The discovery halted all work. Police arrived within the hour. Sheriff Baird, now graying and slower than he once was, stood silent as forensic teams descended into the small chamber. Clara Ricks followed behind him, eyes narrowed, face pale. She had been waiting for something, anything, to break the silence that had cloaked the Whitmore case since 1985. Now, finally, the ground itself was speaking. Inside the sealed cavity, investigators found 2 skeletal remains, wrapped tightly in blankets. The first, taller, broader, was positioned protectively, arms curled around the smaller form next to it. The second was unmistakably a child. Both were dressed in clothes so degraded by time that colors and fabric types were barely distinguishable. But the outlines were clear, and in the pocket of the larger blanket they found something else. A tarnished gold watch, still etched on the back, with the initials G.W. Clara stepped forward and stared down into the pit, her mind racing, not with relief, but with questions. Who sealed them here? Why? And how had this chamber, so precisely hidden, gone unnoticed for so long? The floor plans offered no answers. Even the original church schematics from 1920, stored in the county's historical archive, showed no indication of such a compartment. It had not been part of the original structure. It had not been added by official renovation, which meant it had been built quietly, secretly, and with intent. The presence of poured concrete, inconsistent with all surrounding materials, told investigators it had been constructed hastily but thoroughly, likely over a weekend or holiday when no work crews would be present. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came not from the bodies themselves, but from the items found near them. A rusted thermos, long dry. A child's sketchbook, torn, water-damaged, but still faintly legible, the pages filled with pencil drawings of crows, a bell tower, and a man with a beard. Nina's hand, unmistakable in its nervous, looping cursive, had signed her name at the bottom of a page. Near her was a small charm bracelet, 4 heart-shaped beads still intact, one spelling the letter N. Clara recognized it instantly. It had been described in Gerald's missing persons report, the bracelet Nina always wore, a birthday gift from her father. The forensic team estimated the bodies had been there for at least 7 to 8 years, consistent with the timeline of their disappearances. Cause of death wasn't immediately clear, no signs of blunt force trauma, no fractures, no defensive wounds, but oxygen samples taken from the sealed chamber suggested suffocation due to lack of airflow. They had not been killed violently. They had been buried alive. Clara stepped outside the church, heart thudding, unable to breathe. She leaned against the stone wall and stared up at the tower. What she had feared for years had just been confirmed. Gerald and Nina had never left Rosefield. They had been right here, beneath the very floor the town had prayed over, cried beside, and walked across without knowing. And someone had put them there with purpose, with calculation, and with enough power to ensure they would not be found until now. The Rosefield coroner's report arrived 2 days after the bodies were extracted from the hidden cavity beneath St. Mary's pulpit. Sheriff Baird opened the envelope with trembling hands, flanked by Clara Ricks and a forensic liaison from Eugene. The results were sobering. Both Gerald Whitmore and Nina had died from acute oxygen deprivation, suffocation due to sealed confinement. There were no signs of external trauma. No fractured bones, no bruising. The child's skeletal remains were undisturbed, the arms folded gently as if she had fallen asleep. Gerald's position was telling. Curled slightly toward her, his rib cage collapsed inward in the classic pattern of oxygen starvation, his jaw frozen in an open, silent gasp. The time of death, based on the degradation of tissue and environmental data from the sealed chamber, aligned almost perfectly with the day of their disappearance, June 14, 1985. The absence of struggle ruled out a violent ambush. They hadn't been attacked. They had been trapped, left to expire in silence, beneath the feet of an entire town. Claire stared at the report's summary page, her thoughts circling like vultures. If Gerald had known about the hidden chamber, and if he had once told Louise to reseal a suspicious cavity there, then what had changed in the hours before his disappearance? Why had he taken Nina with him? Why had they ended up inside that space, with no tools, no way to communicate, no chance to escape? Answers, or fragments of them, came in the form of a small leather-bound notebook found tucked into the inside pocket of Gerald's deteriorated blazer. Despite the damage caused by time, moisture, and decay, several pages were still legible, the ink faded but intact. The entries were sporadic, disconnected, as if the notebook had served as both planner and confessional. The first few pages dealt with routine matters, appointment reminders, budget meetings, personal notes about Nina's school projects, but then, abruptly, the tone shifted. One entry, dated May 3, 1985, read, "Received anonymous tip, check west wall foundation under pulpit. Discrepancy in original stoneworking, cross-fracture with blueprints from 47 expansion. Possible undocumented structure?" Another entry, scribbled in haste on June 10, Dean asked again about church crawl space. Dodged question. Need to get second look, alone. Then, circled twice on a page marked June 12, if records are accurate, there is a subfloor room, not in any modern plan, possibly used for safekeeping during early town in Connexison. Will investigate with Louise. Must confirm funds match. Clara read the final entries 3 times, her pulse pounding. One sentence stood out, underlined, as though Gerald had written it in a moment of fearful clarity. If the numbers don't add up, someone's hiding the money, possibly under our feet. That sentence, paired with the next line, meet with Nina after church visit, bring sketchbook, suggested something chilling. Gerald had not intended to vanish that day. He had planned to meet his daughter afterward. He had gone into the church with the intention to confront something, perhaps someone, and then return. But instead, he had never left. The last legible sentence in the notebook, a fragment cut off at the edge of a torn page, read, "If they know I've found the room, they'll—" It ended there. For Clara, the implications were crushing. Gerald had uncovered a hidden chamber tied not only to architectural oddity, but possibly to financial misconduct, embezzlement, unreported cash flow, siphoned funds. She remembered Wallace Dean's moratorium on all church renovations, the immediate sealing of budget records, the rushed audits that folded the preservation fund into broader municipal budgets. Wallace had known, or at least suspected, that Gerald was close to exposing something. But what Clara couldn't yet piece together was how Dean had known Gerald's movements that morning. Who had followed him into the church? Who had sealed the concrete before dusk? The concrete itself became its own line of evidence. Forensic engineers determined that the type and composition used in the hidden slab were not from the town's general inventory. A local cement supplier confirmed that a small batch matching the mixture had been picked up on June 14 under a contractor name not tied to any open permits. The name used, Whitmore Civic Renovation Trust. Claire knew for a fact that no such trust existed under town records. The permit was fake. Someone had used Gerald's name to acquire concrete hours after he went missing, and within that same day, the slab was poured over his body and his daughter's. The logistics of it were damning. The speed, precision, and timing pointed to more than one person involved, someone who had access, influence, and an unshakable reason to bury Gerald's findings, literally and permanently. But Clara couldn't yet confront Wallace, not without a direct link. She needed more, someone who could confirm the use of Gerald's signature, someone who had seen records being altered or destroyed. And she needed access to the church's old renovation logs, which were still being withheld by the town's Engineering Oversight Board, led, not coincidentally, by Wallace Dean's former campaign treasurer. Everything led back to the same corridor of names, men who had risen quietly through Rosefield's infrastructure during Gerald's absence, men who had benefited from the silence. At the station, Clara laid the notebook pages side by side, arranging the timeline. There was a gap between June 10 and June 14. No entries, no sketches. She flipped back to the earlier pages, scanning for anything that could fill the void. That's when she noticed a crude map, half-sketched on the inner back cover. It was not labeled, but it appeared to represent the sanctuary from an overhead perspective. One corner was marked with an X, and next to it, Gerald had written, "Check lower ledger under stairwell, possible entry to original room." Clara's mind snapped into gear. The stairwell, Louise had never mentioned anything about that area. The hidden cavity they found had only one visible access point, above. But what if there was another? A lower entrance, bricked over decades ago, long forgotten except by whoever first discovered it. She rose from her desk, grabbed her keys, and left the station without a word. The church sat quietly under overcast skies, its bell tower casting a long, unmoving shadow across the gravel lot. Clara parked behind the building and entered through the side door, the air inside thick with age and dust. Her footsteps echoed in the sanctuary as she made her way to the pulpit, and then down the narrow corridor that led to the southern stairwell. She stopped halfway down the steps, flashlight in hand, and shone it along the wall. Nothing, just smooth stone and faded plaster. But then, near the baseboard, she saw it, a patch of wall ever so slightly recessed, its mortar lines misaligned with the rest of the foundation. She crouched, ran her fingers along the edge, and felt a faint seam, filled in with decades-old mortar. Behind it, if Gerald's map was correct, lay a second entrance to the space beneath the pulpit. Or perhaps another chamber entirely. Her breath caught. If someone else had used this passage in 1985, they could have sealed it without disturbing the upper floorboards. They could have come and gone without being seen, without anyone ever knowing. Until now. Back at the station, Clara Ricks had the notebook reanalyzed after a casual but sharp-eyed remark from the Eugene forensic liaison during a follow-up review. "The final signature looks off," the man had said, tilting the page beneath a forensic lamp. At first, Clara dismissed it as decay, ink spread, paper worn by time. But something about the observation stuck. She submitted the notebook to the State Handwriting Analysis Unit for deeper comparison. A week later, the results arrived in an unassuming manila envelope. The conclusion sent a jolt through Clara's spine. While the majority of the entries were confirmed to be Gerald Whitmore's handwriting, consistent with letters, municipal records, even a recipe card filed at the Final Society, the last signature on the final page, along with two short lines near it, did not match. It had similar strokes, similar pressure, but lacked the micro-consistencies that defined Gerald's writing. Slanting on lowercase e, a looped tail on his lowercase h. It was close, deliberately close, but not the same. Someone had forged his handwriting after his death. Clara stared at the report, the weight of its implication impossible to ignore. The forgeries were minimal but targeted. They appeared only at the conclusion of the notebook, where the tone shifted most dramatically. The final sentence, cut off at the edge of a torn page, now carried a new meaning. "If they know I've found the room, they'll—" That dash had once seemed tragic, a moment interrupted by fate. But now, it looked like it was written by someone else, trying to simulate a panic Gerald never got the chance to express. That someone had added it later, to divert attention or control a narrative. Clara felt sick. She returned to the church that afternoon, unable to silence the gnawing unease. If someone had gone to the trouble of altering the notebook, they had access to Gerald's body before it was sealed beneath concrete. which meant one of two things. Either Gerald had been coerced to write under duress before his death, or someone involved in the cavity had staged the evidence later. Either way, it required knowledge of the notebook and the opportunity to plant it post-mortem. That meant access. That meant proximity. That meant someone close. Inside the cold, echoing expanse of St. Mary's, Clara stood beneath the choir loft, watching motes of dust drift in the light slicing through the stained glass windows. She wandered to the pipe organ, a majestic but long-neglected instrument that had once filled the sanctuary with thunderous hymns. Its wooden casing had chipped and dulled with age, but the metal pipes still stood like sentinels, towering behind the altar. Something about it tugged at her. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation. Either way, she stepped behind it, brushing cobwebs aside as she crouched near the base. The compartment wasn't obvious, but behind the lower console, nestled in a narrow cavity usually used for storing tuning tools, Clara found a small wooden box, wedged awkwardly beneath a rusted bracket. She pried it loose. Inside was a single unmarked envelope, yellowed but sealed. It had no address, no date, but as she slid the letter out, her fingers trembling, she saw Gerald's name written across the top in looping black ink. And below it, just two short lines. "You're getting too close. Say nothing about the subfloor or the funds, or Nina will pay for your secrets." Clara froze. The letter was unsigned. No threat screamed in capital letters, no claims of power, just cold warning, calculated and concise. Someone who knew what he was investigating, and more disturbingly, who knew he had brought his daughter into the fold. Clara held the letter beneath her nose. There was a faint odor of mildew and something else, candle smoke perhaps. Whoever hid it had known the organ's interior was rarely accessed. It had likely sat there for years, protected by its own irrelevance. She rushed it back to the station where forensic specialists scanned the paper for prints. It yielded two partials, neither belonging to Gerald. But they were too incomplete for a match. The ink, however, was identified as a type used exclusively in ledger pens distributed through municipal offices between 1982 and 1986. Clara dug through archived inventory requests and found one notable request for replacement ink cartridges in early 1985, signed by Wallace Dean. It wasn't definitive, but it added yet another thread connecting Dean to the core of the mystery. Clara's mind spiraled, with the layers now stacking one atop the other. The faked signature, the warning letter, the forged trust documents used to acquire concrete. Everything pointed not just to a crime, but a cover-up that spanned years and multiple hands. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of preservation, of silence, of control. She returned to the evidence locker and requested the sketchbook, recovered with Nina's remains. It had mostly faded, but there were enough fragments of her art to show how aware she had become of her father's investigations. One page showed a crude diagram, possibly the subfloor chamber, drawn in childlike precision. Another depicted a man in a suit standing behind a pulpit, but his face had been erased with heavy graphite. Only his ring remained visible, a square silver band with what looked like a crest. Clara blinked. She had seen that ring before. Wallace Dean wore something similar during town council meetings, an old family heirloom he never took off. The image haunted. She flipped back through the notebook's final pages, tracing the shift in tone once again. The earlier entries were methodical, focused. Gerald had been digging through fiscal reports, historical permits, even charitable grants filed under pseudonymous donors. But then, in the last week, his words had become jittery, paranoid, repetitive. Watch the stairs. Check for cameras. Dean asked about Nina. And then that final entry. Likely not written by him at all. It wasn't just about hidden money anymore. It was about who had the most to lose if that money was ever traced. Who had the knowledge, the influence, and the detachment to bury two bodies in a church and seal the truth for nearly a decade. Claire stared at the timeline again, this time with the letter next to it. Whoever wrote that note knew Gerald wouldn't listen, and instead of waiting for him to stop, they made him disappear. And as she turned off her desk lamp that night, Clara realized she was being watched. The feeling was faint, a prickle at the back of her neck. Nothing outside the window, no sound on the street, but she had been working too long in silence, and someone out there had grown used to the quiet. They had buried Gerald once, they might be ready to do it again. In the dim back room of the Rosefield Records Department, Clara Ricks and a forensic accountant from the state treasury pored over dusty boxes of archived ledgers, forgotten budget memos, and handwritten authorization forms that hadn't seen light in over a decade. The scent of mildew clung to every sheet, and many of the ink markings had faded into ghosts of numbers and signatures. But within this forgotten maze of bureaucratic ink and secrecy, something emerged, a pattern. Over the course of 6 weeks in early 1985, a total of $480,000, 0 cents, had been quietly funneled from the Preservation and Renovation allocation, Phase 1, into a private holding account listed under the contractor name Dean Holdings. Clara sat back in her chair, breath caught mid-throat. Dean Holdings, Wallace Dean's privately owned construction logistics shell. On paper, it had ceased operation in 1986, just after Wallace rose to interim mayor. The timing was no coincidence. Clara traced a signature that approved the final transfer. It wasn't Gerald's. It wasn't even a current council member's. It belonged to Wallace Dean himself, filed during a brief window in late May 1985 when Gerald had reportedly been away for a conference in Portland, though Clara now suspected that may have been a fabrication to remove him from the approval loop. The real dagger came from the annotation in the margin of the transfer order. 3 hastily scribbled initials, J.E.W. But they didn't match Gerald's verified handwriting. They were forged. Again. Armed with this discovery, Clara contacted Robert Hensley, a retired town accountant who had relocated to Spokane years earlier. She found him through an old union directory and convinced him to meet her in a diner just outside his neighborhood. Hensley, a weary man with thinning hair and a twitchy habit of drumming his fingers on the tabletop, was hesitant at first. "That was a lifetime ago," he muttered between sips of bitter coffee. "I thought no one even remembered that mess." Clara showed him the transfer logs, the margin signature, and asked directly, "Were you ever asked to modify any records in 1985? Anything relating to the church renovation budget?" Robert went silent. For a full minute, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then he nodded once. Yeah, I was." He explained that sometime in June 1985, Wallace Dean had come into his office after hours. Said he needed Robert to retroactively align a batch of municipal payments to match an incoming audit request. At first it sounded procedural, just shuffling ledger categories, but then Wallace handed him a pre-spreading list of adjusted amounts, all designed to obscure a single outgoing trail. It was money that had left the town's reserve and ended up in a private contractor's account. When Robert questioned it, Wallace smiled tightly and said, "It's either your job or your reputation. Choose wisely." Clara pressed further. "Did he ever mention Gerald?" Robert hesitated, then nodded again. "One night I stayed late, heard Wallace on the phone in the break room, didn't hear much, but I'll never forget one line. Gerald's too curious for his own good. He's not the kind of man who knows how to keep his mouth shut." After that, I knew whatever was happening, it wasn't just accounting. Clara's hand clenched around her pen. The pieces clicked together with startling clarity. Wallace had used his position on the council and his access to financial records to quietly divert nearly $500,000 from public funding. When Gerald began suspecting discrepancies, Wallace acted swiftly, first isolating him, then feeding him misdirection, all while planning how to permanently eliminate the threat. And when Gerald got too close, when he uncovered the hollow chamber beneath St. Mary's and linked it to the missing funds, Wallace had turned desperation into design. Nina had been used as leverage, a silent hostage in a plan Gerald couldn't anticipate. Clara returned to the station and filed an official evidence report. This wasn't just misconduct, it was premeditated fraud and likely conspiracy to commit murder. But more importantly, it proved that Wallace Dean had both motive and means. Gerald's silence wasn't coincidence. It had been manufactured. She walked down the corridor to Sheriff Baird's office and dropped the evidence binder on his desk. "Have enough?" she said, voice low. "Enough to subpoena every account Wallace Dean touched? Enough to reopen the case not as a missing persons, but a cover-up?" Baird didn't argue. For the first time in years, something in his eyes shifted, resolve long buried under politics and pressure. That evening, Clara received a call from the county prosecutor's office. They would move to issue a warrant, pending court approval, but as she sat alone in the break room afterward, lights low and the hum of the vending machine filling the silence, a chilling thought settled over her. If Wallace had gone this far before, what was he willing to do now, especially if he suspected the walls were finally closing in? Clara reached into her bag and retrieved Nina's sketchbook again. She flipped to the back cover where a single word had been scribbled in haphazard crayon. Safe? She had no answer. Not yet. Not with Wallace still free. Not with so many doors in Rosefield still locked. Not while silence still protected the ones who had built it. The final strands of the story began to tangle themselves into a knot too tight to ignore. Following Robert Hensley's confession and the damning discovery of the forged ledger transfers, Clara requested access to the archive's security reports from June 14, 1985, the night Gerald and Nina disappeared. Though Rosefield had no formal surveillance back then, the local firehouse had kept weather logs and dispatch call records, and one curious detail emerged. That night, a call had come in to report unusual noise near St. Mary's Church, grinding sounds, clanking metal, described by the caller as light construction, but at the wrong hour. The call had been logged at 11:42 p.m. The responding officer never filed a full report, attributing the noise to thunder and rain, which, as the logs confirmed, had fallen heavily that evening. But Clara didn't let it go. She pulled the weather satellite data from regional records. Heavy rain began around 8:50 p.m. and continued past midnight. The noise complaint coincided precisely with a window of time when no permits were active and the church was supposedly closed. But more than that, something else emerged from the investigation. Cell tower logs and rotary call records had preserved a fragment of a call made from the town hall landline to the police station at 6:03 a.m. the next morning. The voice on the line identified himself as Gerald Whitmore, claiming he was leaving town with Nina for a family matter. The voice was never verified, and no follow-up was conducted. But Clara cross-referenced this timestamp with a ledger request made that very morning, one that authorized the immediate cement delivery to the Dean Holdings site near downtown. The signature? Again a mismatched sea-waif in barely passable script. It was a script forensic analysis now confirmed was consistent with Wallace Dean's handwriting, not Gerald. Clara stared at the pattern unfolding. A stormy night, a forged phone call, a late delivery of concrete, and an anonymous noise report dismissed as weather. The orchestration was almost perfect. The true horror unfolded in the sequence she now believed. Sometime after nightfall, Wallace had confronted Gerald at the church. Maybe it was under pretense, a late inspection, a final look at the substructure. Maybe Wallace had offered a false truce, a conversation in confidence. Gerald had trusted him enough, or at least long enough, to walk into that sanctuary one last time, daughter in tow. Whether Wallace had a weapon or simply leveraged fear remains unclear, but once inside, Gerald and Nina had been led to the pulpit, to the hidden opening, to the trap. Luis Contreras's earlier statement now came rushing back, how Gerald had known about the hollow bricks but stopped the excavation suddenly. Gerald had been warned or had discovered something that made him hesitate. But in those final moments, Wallace used that very knowledge against him. He placed Gerald and Nina inside that space, that small breathless cavity under the church, and sealed it. Not the next morning, not days later, but immediately, while the rain pounded against the church windows, masking the sound of a cement mixer grinding in the dark, Wallace and perhaps one other person had poured fresh concrete over living people. They didn't scream, or if they did, no one could hear them. The downpour was too loud, the night too loud. And Wallace had planned for every beat. He returned to town hall before dawn and placed the call himself, mimicking Gerald's voice with enough calm and authority to be believed. "Family emergency," he'd said. "Nina and I are leaving immediately." Then he filed a report stating Gerald had cleared a leave of absence and would resume duties the following week. By the time anyone asked questions, the floor had hardened, the lie had settled like stone. Clara pushed further, subpoenaing the delivery invoices from the cement company. Most were missing, rejected, or vague, but one carbon copy remained, tucked in the bottom of a secondary archive bin, misfiled under park maintenance. It confirmed that at 10:56 p.m. on June 14, 1985, a batch of fast-drying concrete was delivered to Job Site 17, Miss Understack's Key, provided. The delivery driver had initialed the form, and though the original pen strokes had faded, forensic scanning revealed an added note in faint pencil along the edge. Client said it's for rapid fill, no air gaps. That note, Clara realized, could only mean one thing: whoever placed that order didn't want the mix to leave room for sound, movement, or suspicion. It was designed to entomb. She took the findings to the state prosecutor. Charges were being prepared not just for fraud and forgery, but for premeditated murder. Still, Wallace Dean had not yet been arrested. The case was too delicate. Claire was instructed to stay quiet, but the silence felt heavier now, poisoned with every truth buried under it. Wallace still walked free, still held meetings, still wore the silver-ringed hand that Nina had drawn, still smiled at council events as if the walls around him weren't already cracking. But then came the final confirmation. A former church janitor, recently contacted by Clara, agreed to come forward after nearly 10 years in silence. He recalled that in June of 1985, Wallace had asked him to disable the maintenance alarm at St. Mary's for one night only, claiming a special inspection was being done to finalize city compliance. The janitor complied, not thinking twice. He only remembered it now because of something Wallace had said afterward, in passing. "Appreciate your discretion, Tom. Some things are better sealed off." And indeed they had been until now. On the morning of December 7, 1993, Rosefield police executed a quiet but deliberate arrest outside Wallace Dean's residence on Lantern Hill Drive. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He merely adjusted the collar of his coat and told his wife not to wait up. The warrant, approved by the county judge less than 12 hours earlier, was supported by the final piece of physical evidence: a DNA match between a strand of coarse gray hair found embedded in the blanket wrapped around Gerald Whitmore's remains, and a sample collected from Wallace's personal toothbrush during a voluntary property inspection a week prior. The match was not just probable, it was statistically conclusive. Wallace had been there. He had touched the fabric. He had sealed that chamber. And for 8 years he had smiled through the funerals, given speeches at council meetings, and walked beneath the stained glass windows of St. Mary's without flinching. Now that silence cracked. The trial began in early March 1994 and was held at the Clatsop County Courthouse under heightened security due to media attention. Clara Ricks was called to testify as the lead investigator. Her timeline, supported by financial records, eyewitness accounts, forged documents, and forensic findings, that even Wallace's defense counsel stumbled trying to dismantle it. They argued motive was circumstantial, the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that Wallace had once helped distribute supplies during the church renovation, and the hair could have fallen then. But then came the financial trail: $480,000, 0 cents missing, unaccounted for, diverted into Dean Holdings and traced through a cascade of shell accounts. The defense called it mismanagement. The prosecution called it theft. But it was the testimony of Robert Hensley, the former accountant, that sealed the mood in the courtroom. Calmly he described the pressure, the forged ledgers, the veiled threats. He described hearing Wallace say Gerald wasn't the kind of man who kept his mouth shut. His voice didn't shake. He didn't embellish. He simply told the truth. Then came Tom Merriweather, the janitor, who confirmed disabling the maintenance system at St. Mary's on Wallace's request. Then Clara presented the delivery log from June 14, 1985, the order for rapid set concrete signed by a forged GW and paid for in cash. Then the phone call recording surfaced. Though the quality was low, forensic voice analysis concluded with 87% certainty that it was not Gerald's voice, but likely Wallace's slow-ad masquerade, masking his tone under the excuse of urgency. Still, Wallace pled not guilty. He sat through each hearing, each day, with his arms folded and mouth tight, refusing to respond to questions that probed motive, relationships, or remorse. "I did not kill Gerald Whitmore," he said when asked directly during his testimony. "And I loved that little girl like she was my own niece." This is a political witch hunt? But the evidence said otherwise. The blanket fibers, the forged budget requests, the altered blueprints, The final page of Gerald's notebook with mismatched handwriting. The drawing in Nina's sketchbook, the ring on the suited man's hand. All of it pointed in one direction. After 5 weeks of arguments, the jury took less than 6 hours to return their verdict. Guilty. On all charges, Wallace Dean was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter in the first degree, financial fraud, tampering with evidence, and unlawful concealment of human remains. He was sentenced to 37 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 25. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Wallace's expression didn't change. As he was escorted from the room, Clara watched him turn back once, not toward her, not toward the gallery, but toward the empty jury box, as though still searching for someone to believe him. The town of Rosefield changed after the trial, not visibly, not right away. The church resumed services and the pulpit was rebuilt with new wood, blessed by a new pastor. But beneath the surface, a wound remained. Locals no longer spoke of St. Mary's as a sanctuary. Children no longer played near the bell tower. Tourists were discouraged from asking about the hidden room. And the phrase, hollow foundation, became something darker, an unspoken symbol for what had once been trusted and had betrayed them. A modest plaque was placed at the side entrance of the church near the choir loft. It read simply, "In memory of Gerald and Nina Whitmore, lost to silence, found in truth." Clara continued serving with the department for another 7 years before retiring early. She moved out of town and rarely returned, except once, on a quiet fall afternoon in 1998, to visit that plaque. She stood there for a long time, hand resting on the cold stone, eyes closed, not out of grief, but gratitude, for Gerald, for Nina, for the voice that had refused to be buried. Because some foundations should never have been built, and some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, still rise when the earth begins to speak. If this story gripped you the way it did us, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next twist that could change everything. What detail shocked you the most in Gerald and Nina's case, and where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.